All right, today I'm speaking with Jamie Roberts. And Jamie, you're an academic at Sydney University in Australia and the author of the book, The Way of the Intellectual Dark Web, What Joe Rogan and His Associates Can Teach Us About Political Dialogue. And I'm very curious about your book and your life and your experiences and what prompted you to reach out to me. And so could you maybe start by saying a little bit about yourself and your background?
Okay, so where to begin? I guess what ultimately put me on the trajectory I'm on now is somewhere around the age of about 20 or 21. I suppose I caught philosophy pretty badly. That's kind of like the way I feel, you know? It's like some sort of moment of, we often have these moments where life takes a turn. And so from about that point on, I felt, I suppose, what else could I say other than like something like a hunger for the truth? And so I was initially studying psychology at university. And I still have a huge interest in psychology, but after, a bit of a, I don't know, epiphany or whatever, I then moved towards English literature because I felt like, as much as I'm interested in psychology, I felt like the insights in literature were somehow a little deeper, a little more immediate, even though you still have to like unpack them and extract them. And I'm still trying to make sense of what's actually meant by the knowledge contained in literature. But still, that really interested me. And then that led me into philosophy, but more like the unconventional philosophers who didn't spend quite so much time in the system, I suppose, like Nietzsche, I suppose Rousseau, going all the way back to Plato, that kind of thing. And I suppose the more I read, the more I studied philosophy, the more I began to identify, I suppose you'd call them enduring patterns, forms, to use Plato's term. And I was doing this within the university, first within English literature. Then I had, I had my first sort of, you wouldn't exactly call it cancellation, but you'd call it, run-in with identity politics and postmodernism, which interestingly, I was far more of a postmodernist when I was younger. Like I drank the Kool-Aid to a reasonable degree, but after a year or two of questioning, I found it didn't hold up. Anyway, these are all things I can get to. I ended up in a politics department because it turned out I couldn't do English the way I wanted in an English department. That's a long story as well, but mostly because of, whether you want to call it post-structuralism, postmodernism, those kinds of issues. So I ended up in a politics department, ended up doing a PhD at the University of New South Wales, which is up the road from the University of Sydney. In it, I tried to develop a sort of a whole, I don't know, philosophical or political or ethical model, which where I tried to explain essentially why people struggled so much to pursue truth and why we were so tribal. It was interesting. So much of the stuff people have been talking about the last 4 or 5 years, this is why I got into Joe Rogan, what people call the intellectual dark web. I had such a strong sense. This was in the mid to late 2000s. I had such a strong sense that academia was just like some kind of religious cult. And like the term religious was really, it was very, very, very strong for me. And so I sort of worked this into my whole model that I developed in my PhD. And but it was a strange kind of lonely existence because I felt like I was the sane person in the crazy system or the one crazy person in the sane system. But I felt very much like an outsider because I just kept thinking, can't you all see what's going on here? Can't you all see that there's just so many things we can't talk about, but that we need to talk about? And like the most important things that we need to talk about, we can't talk about. Basic things like surely everyone can see everyone's just building careers on almost nothing, on dogma. And it really bothered me. And I was so naive because I kept thinking, but surely we're all here because we're committed to truth. And so if we're committed to truth and we're all just building careers on dogma, then there's something really wrong with the system. And then, of course, you sort of think, no, wait, there's a reason people don't want to talk about it. And so I don't know, after the PhD, it kind of led me into a sort of a limbo, which I probably never really left. I ended up teaching academic skills of all things. I really wanted to be an academic, but I was just thinking, I couldn't really work out how I could write about what I was seeing. You know, I tried a little bit to get my PhD published as a book, but everything, it just felt impossible to say what I was seeing. And so I ended up teaching, essay writing, critical thinking, speaking skills, which ended up being really good, honest work, because it turned out I was operating, at sort of like a basic intellectual level, which is what's actually required at university. So, you know, what problem are we addressing? What are all the possible solutions? Weighing up all the different perspectives, which is just like basic essay writing, basic critical thinking, basic Enlightenment values. So that ended up being okay. I ended up writing a couple of academic skills books of all things, which I never thought I'd do. And remarkably, I ended up working at Sydney University actually as an academic, like 10 years after I thought it would never occur. I needed, stuff happened in life. I needed to get a job. I'd written a couple of books. I had 10 years of teaching, not just in academic skills, but I'd been teaching international relations, literature, all sorts of stuff. And turned out my CV looked pretty good in the end. And I got a job at Sydney University in the politics department, teaching politics, popular culture, international relations, international security. Because I was an academic, it was like, okay, time to do some more writing. It's quite hard to write academic articles because, well, it's not hard to write them, but it's hard to publish them, because if I say what I really think, you tend to, the gatekeeping's pretty heavy. Even recently, I've had this experience of trying to publish a reasonably controversial article, and you don't really even make it past the editor. It doesn't go out to review. You get comments like, we'll never be able to get this through the review process. But what I was able to do was write a book and get a book contract, which kind of brings me close to where we are now. And I realized the exact thing to write about was all of these podcasts, all of these figures, which so many of us are familiar with. Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, the Weinstein brothers. And then, everyone else. There's like layers and layers and layers. There's like a core, then there's like another sort of 10 or 15 people under there. Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, Elon Musk, frankly, I have no doubt he's in there. Jonathan Haidt, Steven Pinker, and then there's like layers and layers, and they, and everyone's talking to each other. And the remarkable thing is that is what really blew me away. All this stuff which is just driving me nuts through the 2000s and I didn't think anyone was onto, turns out everyone's noticing the same thing the world over. And it's quite heartening, because you think, well, we're probably onto something. And a lot of it is people like me, disaffected liberals. I've spent pretty much my whole adult life on the left. So it's not like I ever saw myself as a conservative. But but the politics on the left, which people, I guess, initially called political correctness, now we call it woke, their term, not ours. We're all seeing the same thing. We're all annoyed by the same thing. And so, it really does then give that strong sense that there's something really substantial that we're all identifying. So I wrote the book about it, wrote a book about it, attempting to provide basically a summary with a lot of quotes of all of these key issues that all of us are interested in. And then it published earlier this year. And then within 2 weeks of publishing, a complaint, or maybe more than one complaint, I don't know, rolled in. The book was withdrawn from circulation. And that's where we're at now.
Wow. And withdrawn from circulation even.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, I was amazed it made it that far. Yeah. I'm amazed I've made it this far, because you have that very strong sense that there are a lot of these things which really can't be said, and they can't be said. They shouldn't be said, not within the broader academic realm. You can say it in internet or podcast realm, but you can't say it in the academic realm. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at now. I've got the Free Speech Union in the UK are helping me out, you know, to deal with the publishers. But yeah, I'm not sure how it's all going to progress from here. But yeah, there you go. That's my story, more or less.
So in the 2000s, and when you're in academia and you're noticing that there are these untouchable subjects that it sounds like you're in this state of kind of confusion about that. Like, don't you want to talk about this too? Shouldn't we be talking about everything? And then finding yourself coming up against these walls. And then you start listening to, as these podcasts are coming out and all these intellectuals are talking about these things in this really open fashion. They're talking about the very things that you felt. You use this really interesting phrase there. You called, you said academia is a religious cult. Is it? And so that's interesting. And I kind of want to explore that a little bit more. Was it unspoken, the things that you couldn't talk about? Did you just have a sense and know, but you knew you just couldn't go certain places, or were there hard lines?
This question of taboo really, really fascinates me. And the more I think about it, the more I have the sense that we humans are remarkably good at identifying the taboos of our time with very little information. I think we're barely conscious of it. I think we're conscious of whatever. I mean, and the taboos do shift around depending on what sort of cultural milieu you're in. So, I mean, if I was probably moving in religious circles on the right, I'd probably have a different sense of what I can and can't say. But yeah, I think we have a very strong sense of, what should I say? No. Like within like certain cultural milieus, like if you're in a certain institution, a certain political realm, I think, yeah, it's remarkable. We have a very, very precise sense of what the taboos are, and everyone just knows. I didn't at first. I was naive. Like when I was doing my honours degree, which is like a fourth-year dissertation in Australia, I really had that sense that everyone in academia wanted to talk about everything. And so I was pushing pretty hard, making arguments which I'll still make today. I was writing about gender stuff, men and women relationships, and I learned quite quickly, and I had a supervisor who was, in my sense, from my point of view, unethical essentially. But yeah, she came down very, very hard on me and was insisting that I say certain things which I didn't really want to say, and I didn't say them. And it was through that process that I then realized, that there really were just, places you can't go. And then when I moved on to a PhD after that, because I managed to get through and do well enough to, go on to the PhD level. Yeah, then when I was immersed in that, further in the academic environment, it was more, I'm not answering the question that well, but it really is an intuition. And you really, we all just intuit what can't be said. So I think we all ultimately know at some level that we're in the cult because we're aware of the taboos. And yet when you encourage people to look at the taboos, people kind of deny it. I always feel like it's for me, like I often use the metaphor of it's like trying to look at the sun, I often feel like in someone like Plato, the sun is often like the light which reveals truth. And it's quite similar to like Christianity. God is the light, what is it? The first part of John in the Bible, God is the word, the light, So we often have that kind of metaphor, but I have the sense that when you try to look directly at it, you can't. And so I'm not being quite as precise here as I'd like, but I'm just trying to talk my way into the feeling of taboos. Because no one says you can't talk about A, B, C, D, and E. Because if they say that, you then say, well, why can't you talk about A, B, C, D, and E? And the argument never really takes place, because even if you spent 2 or 3 minutes poking at it, it would become absolutely obvious that you should talk about those things. So you start poking in a certain direction, and you get hit by postmodernism. Maybe this is a bit more concrete. You get hit by postmodernism or relativism, or you get hit by something like identity politics or intersectionality, where you'll be told that you can't really talk about those things. Or else, actually, if you're doing a particularly good job, you get met by silence. That often happens too. Or, the more I think about it, you can get disqualified on technicalities, which is kind of what's happening with my book now. I don't think the publisher will say you can't say these things, but you get disqualified. It's like, oh, your scholarship's not quite right, There's all of these little ways that you try to look at the truth, you try to draw attention to it, and there's always things which are just pushing you away. As I say, I'm not being super precise here, but it's difficult to actually put your finger on exactly what happens within institutions around taboos and all of that sort of thing. It's a very subtle process.
I'm really glad you're talking about it this way also, because I think that it is hard to talk about it precisely, because it is such a nebulous thing.
It's nebulous.
And when you said that people are remarkably good at identifying the taboos of our time with very little information, that really resonated with me. And it reminded me of when I went back to school, and people have heard me talk about this quite a bit, but I went back to school after an absence from academia, and I'd been away for about 10 years, and I came back to graduate school, and it was all of a sudden everybody was talking in this certain way that I hadn't been exposed to previously, and I wasn't on a ton of social media, and so it wasn't there. I had very little exposure to this way of talking about, like, white privilege, for instance, or I can't think of a time when I'd ever been exposed to the gender pronoun ritual. And yet, when I got there, and I was in my first interview, I was in a group interview for graduate school, and they asked us to give our name and our pronouns. I knew what I was supposed to do, and I also knew that if I didn't do it, I would be out. So it's like
immediately.
Yeah, but I can't go back in my memory and find a time when when I had concretely learned that. It was just sort of intuitive, and so it's really interesting when you say that. I think that's the question. A lot of people this is a common question, a common discussion of, like, how did you know what you weren't supposed to talk about? How did you know? And yet there are these really powerful social forces that teach us what's right and wrong in a given social, I guess, a social script.
Doesn't it show, though, then how much, and this was so much of my PhD, doesn't it show how much of a religion so much of life actually is? And I mean, I'm not that down on religion at all. You can do it well, you can do it badly, but how much of just basic human life and basic human existence is about belonging to a group in a very deep sense, and being aware that as part of the group, there are things you say and the things you don't say, and adhering to all of that is essentially what makes the group. And so, I have a very strong sense that humans, all of us, whether we like it or not, are religious in a very basic sense.
So you would describe religion as a pattern or a form of social, collective behavior? How would you kind of flesh that out and say how you would define that?
Yeah, and so religion's not really the right word, because religion, for my mind, is a little bit downstream of it. Yeah, I mean, if an epiphany, a realization, or really an opinion, whatever. This is really what dawned on me through my PhD, that humans we belong. Like, it's our great strength. I mean, we managed to achieve so much in, I mean, it's kind of crazy. I mean, obviously it's crazy what we've managed to achieve with technology, so on and so forth. And it's because we operate collectively, and surely, the need to hold the tribe together and to belong to the tribe is, I think, a very highly evolved and very necessary function. But this is like one of those Dunbar number discussions which comes up in the intellectual dark web as well. I mean, the humans evolved in smallish groups. It was very important for the group to hold together. Having various signals that you're part of the group is a really obvious way to you know, that's one of the functions of language that knits us together. But yeah, once you have a sprawling global society of, you know, 7 or 8 billion people, however many we are now, this kind of belonging becomes, what would you say, cancerous or malignant. And so it's this constant battle of trying to develop social systems, which is what, you know, the liberal Western world has managed to do, which kind of offset the more cancerous aspects of you know, group formation. So I'm drifting off topic a little bit here.
No, but, that's really, it's super interesting. I you know, one of the things that happened a lot during COVID was people talking about people that were going along with the restrictions as sheep. And so there was this real looking down on collective formation. And we also hear with gender a lot, we hear talk about social contagion. And this is almost always talked about in a derogatory way. Like, these silly people don't think for themselves. It's kind of the way that we think about it. And yet I think that our ability to move in groups is, as you are pointing out, there's a great strength in that. And it's something that's really innately a part of what we are. Yeah. And so
you can't disown it. The point is to recognize it's a part of human nature, and to then recognize its strengths and weaknesses, and to, you know, not let the weaknesses run away with themselves. And this was, again, this is what really helped me, come to the, you know, whatever like rough hypotheses I was poking around with in my early to mid 20s. Once I started, you know, really reading a lot more widely and, you know, studying the classics, which, by the way, I was told were all bad, you know, 20 years ago. Why would you read Plato? Why would you study the classics? They're all evil. And I'm like, okay, I believe you. And I really did believe. And I'm like, but you know what? I'm going to read them anyway, just to check. And I'm reading them. I'm like, oh my God, this stuff is so good. It's so much better than I could have ever imagined. And it's not like right wing or anything. Frankly, most of it's often quite progressive. And guess what? So many of them are identifying these basic patterns of humans pursuing belonging and power, leading them into a corruption, and trying to work out how we can then push back against that in the pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of, you know, basic human decency, human connection. It's just this eternal battle, which we humans seem to, be a part of. So, anyway.
How fascinating. It is fascinating that you'd be steered away from reading those things, those exact texts that just demonstrate the way that we keep repeating patterns over time, that we're not that much different than we have ever been.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what was so funny. Like, the more and more I read, the more I was like, oh my God, academia is just like, I was a big fan of Stendhal, The Red and the Black. Okay. And he writes about the priesthood, and I'm like, oh my God, we're 200 years later. It's just the same. It's like, oh my God, nothing's changed. Or whatever Nietzsche was talking about in the late 19th century, you're like, oh my God, it's just the same. And Shakespeare, or Plato before that, you're like, oh man, Rousseau. I mean, people complain about Rousseau a fair bit these days because he's got a, you know, pretty, you know, his idea of the noble savage kind of mimics everyone's current, I don't know, infatuation with indigenous people. So but at the same time, he's still a great thinker and has got a lot of really good ideas. But I know one of his great quotes was something like, I'm just paraphrasing, basically, people submit to slavery so that they may in turn enslave others. So looking, you know, basically you put yourself into chains because it then allows you to belong and then climb a hierarchy and be better than other people. So, you know, it's just these same processes. Anyway,
so what was it in your book that was dangerous enough or wrong enough, unorthodox enough to get it withdrawn from publication?
I mean, ultimately, I don't know, and maybe I won't ever know, because, as I say, the objections will be to scholarship, and that there are, you know, you get got on technicalities, but I mean, I talk about basically, I mean, all the taboos that, this intellectual dark web characters were talking about. So, I mean, the worst is always the trans issue. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that's the greatest taboo of today, although things are shifting a little at the moment. just because there's an issue. It just, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, just so little makes sense. And so, you know, it's tricky there. But yeah, talking about the failure of universities, and postmodernism and how that also doesn't make sense. I mean, if you've got a philosophy which at its core says you know, there is no truth, and then the immediate question is, well, if there is no truth, then how are you drawing a salary within an institution, you know? Like, shouldn't you resign right now? I mean, if your opinion is as good as any person on the street, like, well, we didn't mean there is no truth. It's like, yeah, but you say it all day long. No, what we really meant was, you know, so I mean, you know, complaining about that, you know, the echo chamber of academia, yeah, men and women stuff, all of these long discussions, you know, one of the big lines is gender is a social construction, of course, which is just hammered into me relentlessly for the last 20 or 25 years, which I believed and supported for quite a while. But, you know, by the time, you know, hit my mid-40s, I just don't believe it anymore. And it's not to say that there aren't a range of, you know, different ways of being a man and a woman in the world, but I think there's a substantial central tendency that, you know, isn't a social construction, which then means, you know, it's good. This is complicated to talk about precisely, but it means that there are often better or worse ways, I think, to be a man or a woman in the world for most people most of the time. So, you know, that's kind of stuff that Jordan Peterson would talk about. So that's taboo. It's funny, yeah, when you say gender is a social construction, this is what really makes me angry and makes me laugh at the same time. Obviously, with the trans issue now, gender is not a social construction. Gender turns out actually it's an essence after all. And you're like, oh, but, and I keep waiting for the legions of academics who got so angry with me over the years for suggesting that maybe there's a biological component to gender. It's like, well, you know, everything's just flipped like 180 degrees now. Shouldn't everyone write an open letter and say, actually, turns out we were wrong. Gender's not a social construction, it's an essence. But it's just a funny kind of essence, which doesn't actually have anything to do with biological sex, you know?
Yeah.
No one says that. The open letter's never going to come. What am I saying? Yes, I mean, you know, this kind of stuff, it's in the book. Yeah, you know, obviously things like what Douglas Murray talks about, you know, he's got his book, The War on the West. If you had spent any time at university, you know that you're just meant to hate the West. And like I say, I'm kind of a lifelong liberal, you know. Even these days, I might even still be centre left, you know. If I really think about it, I care about, I think there should be public schools run by the government. I think there should be a good public hospital system, which, you know, probably drives a lot of people in America crazy, but I'm yet to be convinced that's not a good idea. In Australia, we're a bit more to the left than America. But anyway, what am I saying? The West. Yeah, I digress. Yeah, you know, just hating the West is just what you're meant to do. And like, it just drives me so mad. One student essay after another, all of these things are just assumed where you know, the West is evil, must decolonize. And yet here everyone is living off the fat of the land, living their comfortable lives in relative peace and stability, living lives the likes of which we've, you know, never lived before, down through the ages. No one wants to leave. And so the point is like, surely, yeah, the West does terrible things, you know. America's record on war in the last, you know, post-World War II is horrific, and Australia's gone along with that often. And like, you know, there's no question that, for me, that capitalism in its worser forms, you know, damages the environment or exploits people, you know. But I'm still a fan of capitalism, you know. But there's just no basic weighing. There's no saying, you know, the West is good in these respects and bad in these respects, which is what any sensible person would do. So that's in the book, you know. Also, all of these key issues, and which are sort of not even really controversial when you just think about them, but you just can't really talk about them at university and in various, you know, and the various intellectual intelligentsia parts of the world that are aligned with university, which, people call, mainstream media. In Australia, the ABC, which is the public broadcaster. In America, BBC. In America, you've got your own, media outlets. So yeah, you just can't have these basic, simple, honest discussions. So yeah, it's all in the book. And yeah, I don't think the book's going to last with this publisher. And so my basic hope is that maybe they can release it and someone else will publish it, something like that. Because, I mean, surely like an intellectual movement which has tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of followers, surely it's important to have like a book which provides an overview of this particular cultural moment. I mean, but yeah, but no, not really, no. Anyway, that's the book, right?
Yeah. So you mentioned, we talked a little bit about religion, and one of the things that keeps being discussed in a lot of these online circles and in podcasts, and we hear this discussion a lot, is that a lot of what we're experiencing is because of the lack of religious values, of the dying off of religion in the West. And so it does seem like, in one of the things that I think is a personally very interesting exploration for me is the exploration of how our culture defines sexual morality. And it seems like it's gone from being a values or virtue-based morality, where we think about things like chastity, monogamy, and procreation, to being a consent and pleasure-based morality. So there's no, so that's something that I feel like is one area where I guess I'm interested in that exploration of what we've done to our culture, but I'm sure we can make arguments like that across the board in lots of places. And so what is your opinion about religion, the role of religion or the role of lack of religion in our culture, and what that's done to our values and virtues as Western society?
Yeah, it's such a deep question, and I ponder it all the time. I mean, I'm not religious, although I almost wish I was. Sometimes, if I as I said before, I think we all have a religion, whether we like it or not. We all belong to something. So what do I belong to? I mean, I belong to maybe, truth, the greatest works of literature, philosophy, whatever. I feel like that's the kind of thing that I belong to. Sorry, I'm not quite answering the question. But I ask myself whether times were better in the past, because it's easy to say, the good old days when we were all religious. And I'm not even to say they weren't like that, but I'm hesitant. I'm hesitant to endorse that. Although what you said about, monogamy, chastity, whatever, I'm a fan, I'm a fan because I think that religion, and this is something that IDW people will talk about, I think religion, or maybe even conservative values, were onto something, in that if you do not provide a sort of structure like this, humans will quite possibly spin off into, as you say, a sort of hedonistic, anarchistic, sort of chaotic pleasure seeking. And so, back in the day, a smaller society would have provided that container. But when humans move from a smaller society to a much, much bigger society, you need new social technology to contain us. And I feel that that's where religion came along. And so we've gotten rid of that now. And as I say, I'm not quite convinced that it was better. I think it may well have been, but I do think there is very much a role for something like that, which finds a way to, like Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that finds a way to try to push down the devils of our nature and lift up the angels of our nature. And religion on a good day, I think, very much performs that function. So I'm not quite answering this as I say, as precisely as I'd like, but yeah, I'm skeptical religion was as good maybe as some people make out, but I still think it's a I still feel like on a good day, it's performing a very important function in providing us a sort of moral container. And I do think we can create that in a secular society. I think we can actually create it through open discussion and reasoning and evidence. I mean, the sexuality thing is something I can talk about forever, but from a very early age, it's really the idea of people using people, which is something I've had to struggle with as a man, you know, from my early 20s. At the same time as I felt a very strong impulse to be that kind of man, I found something revolting in it as well, because ultimately I want to, you know, if I have a partner, I want to connect with them deeply. I don't want to just sort of use them. And so, you know, I've struggled with this myself. And I feel like religion, marriage helps to support that aspect. Something like that. Anyway, I've hopefully spoken to that point a bit.
No, it's fascinating, and it seems to tie in with a lot of the other things that you're talking about, especially with gender. Is it a social construct? And when you talk about this experience of being a man and having these particular areas of life that you've had to exercise discipline over in a masculine perspective, from a masculine life. And so that's definitely not a social construct. That's definitely something that's more biological. And yet we have these social containers that help us to know how we're supposed to direct some of these impulses and help us to frame it in a way that is ultimately, hopefully, oriented in the direction of human thriving. Versus just momentary, I don't know, hedonism, as you say.
But which ultimately leads us to be atomized. And you have moments of pleasure, but you don't deeply connect with people. And by deeply connect, I mean you don't then deeply care about their welfare and they care about your welfare. And so marriage, as shockingly imperfect as it is, because I think in the past it's perhaps worked as can work as a sort of a jail for women. But, you know, and so that's kind of the feminist angle we get. And I think there's something to that. But in throwing it out, we're perhaps missing that it also is a way of, for all its flaws, trying to hold people together. And for such a long time, I was so skeptical of marriages and marriage ceremonies, you know, and just like, what's all this stuff? You wear these silly outfits, you know, like, you know, I'm so not into it. And even now, I'm, you know, not exactly into it. But the more I think about it, you perform these rites and these rituals in front of the community. And so the community sees you and sees you take these vows. And so basically you're then held accountable to all of them that you pledged in front of. And these are all these mechanisms for just trying to hold people together, because we have such a tendency to drift apart, to betray each other, to cheat. And so there's still just this sense that for all its flaws, finding a way to stick together and hold together is probably better than, frankly, what I think we often have now. But it's hard to talk. I mean, so much of this is tricky to talk about because everything is like, you know, maybe I'd say marriage is, you know, like 60% good and 40% bad, whereas the other path is 40% good and 60% bad. So much of this is about trying to say, look, none of these things are perfect, but if we're going to have a social tendency, we probably should go in that direction rather than that direction. That'll create the best outcomes for the most people. So getting back around, I think that's what, religion and frankly, conservative values, I think that is their technology, which is we throw out at our peril.
Well, you're stumbling into the territory of what Jordan Peterson got into so much trouble for, talking about enforced monogamy, when he was really just talking about the way that culture helps to hold people together, helps to reinforce the bond and the pair bond. And he got into so much trouble for that phrase because it sounded like something forceful rather than just something supportive.
As I say, the idea that, you have to get married. And as I say, there is a long, discussion of marriage being something of a jail for women sometimes, but... And
for men, some people would say.
Yeah, for sure.
The ball and chain.
Yeah, no, of course. But I suppose society has a longer tradition of men being able to cheat without as much stigma as women.
Yeah.
You know, as you can see, I've still got some feminist leanings in me in various ways, but yeah.
Huh.
But yeah, I think I mean, what else does Jordan Peterson say? He says, I always want to do the voice, I do a Jordan Peterson
Go ahead, please do it.
Really?
Yeah, sure.
You know, when the plumbing breaks down and the pool's flooded, your relativism then, I don't know. That's the first thing that came to mind. But anyway,
Excellent.
he's not wrong.
No.
What the hell was I saying? Yeah, I had a good point to make, and now I forgot.
Go ahead.
No, ask me a question. I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, another thing that you brought up feminism, and you used it kind of in this sort of offhand way, but that's another thing we hear quite a bit lately from people who are frustrated with where our culture is at this moment. They'll say this all started with feminism. And so it's kind of like when women are protesting men in women's sports or women's bathrooms or changing rooms, one response that is like this very, very frequently scripted response is, well, this is what you get. You started this all with feminism. So it's sort of the snake eating its tail in a way. And okay. I'd love to hear your response to that.
Okay. Yeah. It's a great question. One of this is a relatively obvious point, but it's one of the things that very much occurred to me when I was working on my PhD as well, is pretty much every good thing that humanity starts on ends up being corrupted. Pretty much everything. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that that good thing we started working on wasn't good in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so, you could talk about the Russian Revolution. Mm-hmm. And clearly there was an absolutely staggering problem in Russian society with the oppression of the peasants and the workers. So something had to change. Now, whatever we ended up with the crazy-ass Bolshevik, revolution was not where it should have ended up. But it doesn't mean that the impulse wasn't right. French Revolution, you can probably say similar things, where it ended up with Robespierre and, killing everyone. Feminism's the same. I really do think that there were many things that really did have to change. Like obvious things like women voting, equal pay for equal work, mm-hmm. No discrimination. I mean, in the sense of, sexual harassment, things like that. I mean, these are things which needed to change and needed to be talked about. And so if things have gone nutty now, which they have, Pinker talks about this. A lot of IDW people talk about this. It's just the decadent phase. Mm-hmm. You move through something, it's good for a while. As they say, this is in the book, of course, it doesn't go out of business. It then needs to find new grievances. Mm. The new grievances tend to be a little bit more made up, and then things spiral out of control. But it doesn't mean that first and second wave feminism weren't doing very important things. It's just that wherever we are now, it's gone off the rails. So yeah, as you say, it's a very scripted thing. But to me, that kind of critique of feminism is just shallow. You go down a level or two, and there's just a more complex image. But it's not. But it's not actually hard to say. Mm-hmm. Many things start out good. They go in a decent direction. They have good impulses and good reasons. They actually solve a range of problems. We have progress, and then things go a little crazy. So yeah, that's just the bizarre space that we're in now. Just this weird. Yeah, people call it decadent. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, it's just. Something's gone off the rails pretty seriously.
Well, it's I'm glad you framed it that way, because that framing makes a lot of sense to me. And I tend to, I guess that makes me come back to Aristotle's virtues, where the virtue is the balance point between the dearth and the excess. And so if you use
middle path,
it's yeah. And if
absolutely,
if you use the slippery slope rhetorical fallacy, you can find ways that everything is like the thing at the end of the spectrum from itself. But to do that is to negate the value of the balance point. Yeah.
I'm such a fan of the middle path these days. I find myself coming back to it again and again and again. Like with masculinity, I went from being everything's a social construction, which I believed for quite a while and really pushed for, to actually thinking, no, for most, this is why it's so hard to talk about as well, because you end up with we think in absolutes way too much, you know, like you're either a total, everything's a social construction, emasculated male, or you're stupid Andrew Tate. You know what I mean? And it's like, actually, no, there's quite a wide middle path, which works out all right, you know, where it's like, no, if as a man, I actually do feel like, for the most of us, much of the time, if I attempt to, you know, my goal is to achieve significant things in the world and, you know, support my family. You know, obviously women can do all of these things too, but as a sort of a male identity, to actually try to be strong and try to think of yourself as a provider or a rock or whatever. I mean, God, I can't believe I'm saying these things on the internet, but there is a middle path where you can be, you know, I mean, these are cliches, but you can be a strong male, but you can also be decent and kind and all of those things too. And again, I keep saying, you know, it's not that women can't be these things, but my sense is that is actually a decent male identity that I think will work for a lot of people a lot of the time, which is exactly what Jordan Peterson pushes, you know? So, yeah.
Well, it must be difficult.
Middle path, as you say, Aristotle. That's right.
Yeah.
I think there's a middle path. It's so, I still hesitate to say this stuff because I know how taboo it is.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah, there is a middle path.
That's something I was just thinking about, is that for you, you're still in academia. You're still working in that field.
Barely, but yes.
You must hear the censorious voices in your head when you speak. I mean, it must be really hard to just speak plainly with all those.
Yeah, I've got them
pressure.
right now.
Yeah.
I'm getting my ass kicked now. Like it's, no, but it is like when I'm teaching, I mean, I'd say a portion of what I've said to you when teaching, and when I venture into, God, I mean, it depends. Like sometimes when I feel like I have a really good vibe with the class, I mean, frankly, when the woke quotient's quite low or not present at all, you can often open up and go into these various places. But or sometimes, you know, I risk going into these places and I get punished. Like every semester something goes wrong, you know, and it can be small from like an outburst from a student. It can be big from students forming a cabal and sort of not exactly canceling, but, you know, cancellation is a continuum, you know. You often get like a lot of little minor sort of incidents which essentially just make working within the university remarkably difficult and painful. So the voice is always there. I know exactly what I can and can't say. I know, for example, this is what's so funny. Like I know it's not funny, but you know, class discussion and money discussion is almost totally not taboo these days. Maybe 50 years ago when Marxism was a lot more dominant, when the Soviet Union was not collapsed, you know, maybe the left was probably focused a lot more on this. So maybe there were more taboos around it. But now I can talk about class stuff and money stuff, you know, with pretty much impunity, and that's fine. But the taboo has moved into obviously sex, gender, race, into different areas now. So I'm very, very conscious of the voice, and as I say, it's not a phantom. I do get punished to greater or lesser degrees. If I breach the taboos.
Yeah, I was hoping to ask you about that, because you brought up that you've had some pushback from students, and what has that been like for you? What kind of experiences have you had, and how have you dealt with it?
It's funny. I realize I am actually quite a snowflake, to be honest. Like, why lie? You know, why shy away from it? I feel like I have a passion for the truth. I feel like I want to see human flourishing and all of that. Maybe I've got a kind of autistic obsession with truth. I'm not even sure that I'm getting at the truth. I mean, these are long discussions. How do I know that I'm doing it right? I don't know, really. I mean, I have ideas. But sorry, what the hell what was the question again? I've digressed. What did you say?
About the experience of getting student pushback.
Oh,
as a teacher. Yeah,
that's right. it's tough because, look, in some instances, I think I've dealt with it particularly well, but for the most part, not. If you have a student, if the student openly says something in class, which frankly I absolutely encourage, you know, and they're not totally triggered, then that's actually brilliant, because then we have a discussion. You know, that's precisely what I want. You know, I do not want to be censorious. I say to the students again and again, I say, look, if I say bad stuff, I say, let's do it. Come for me. Say whatever you want. This is the way it should be. I'm ready for anything. So when that happens, it's often really, really good. And, you know, they'll be coming for you and sometimes a bit angry, whatever, but, you know, they're engaged in dialogue. And as long as they're engaged in dialogue, it's awesome. But when it's when it slips into the cancel culture space, which it does sometimes, and it's like, which, you know, happened to me late last year, and it was, you know, frankly, as I said, I'm a bit of a snowflake. I don't deal with it that well. You know, when the name calling starts and when the students, they don't want to talk to you, I say to them, I say, send me emails. You want to talk with me in emails? So I have students sometimes email me, and then we'll have these epic long email exchanges where I can clarify, you know, my thoughts and their thoughts, and that's amazing. But yeah, when it slips into the more cancel culture space where the name calling starts, you know, misogynist, transphobe, you know, Jamie should be removed from this course. Or my favorite from last year, Jamie says there's things he can't talk about at university. He should be removed from teaching this course.
Wow.
It's like, surely you can see the lack of logic in what you just said.
Right.
But no, so when it goes on there and then, you know, bullying from colleagues or superiors, you know, and it's just, well, you know, it takes them a while, but once they realize you're not on their side, you know, there's always bullying, you know, and it's often, you know, it's often sort of just below a threshold, or it's spoken. And so then if you then brought it up, then people say, oh no, I never said that. Like it's so that, yeah. So that's, yeah, you get all those sorts of things. And frankly, if it was one or two, I can kind of handle it. But often what happens is if a lot of them build up, yeah, it's basically, my sense is I want to get the hell out of this crazy place. I think in a previous podcast, what was her name? I tried to remember her name beforehand. The woman you were speaking to a couple of weeks ago anyway, it doesn't matter. But yeah, it's like an abusive relationship, I think was the...
Was it Amy Gallagher?
Yeah, sorry, Amy Gallagher. Yeah, I really tried to prep the name, but you know, whenever I talk, names fall out of my head.
Yeah, no, it's easy to do.
But it's an abusive relationship. It's an abusive relationship where you're constantly on eggshells, where anything that you say that's even sort of reasonable or open gets twisted and used against you. And it's just like a madhouse. And it's really difficult to deal with ultimately, because you're constantly having this sense of wanting to talk, wanting to discuss, wanting to say, this stuff doesn't make sense. We really need to talk about it, which is what should happen at university. That's what critical thinking is about. And then at the same time, I constantly censor myself. People say, you know, you've got to pick your battles. And that's a generous way of saying it. I often just think I'm cowardly and I should fight more and more often and with less fear. And so there's a constant war with myself. And then when I do speak more openly and you get pushback, it's painful, because I mean, if you're not psychopathic, if you're like most people and you're human, then when people, you know, come for you and start calling you names and, you know, you get denounced, like, it's not fun. I don't think anyone really likes that, because we are social creatures, you know? So yeah, that's the wacky old university experience.
Well, as you're talking, and I'm thinking about the middle path, as we spoke about, and how when you're in a situation which calls for you, well, where most people are very polarized, everybody around you is taking these extreme sides. If you try to stand somewhere in the middle and see both and not fall to one side or the other, you can end up being attacked by both. and you can end up in this kind of friendless space, which is difficult. So as you're speaking about this, I do think that would be very hard to maintain an open mind and try to move the needle just a little bit towards openness in a situation where everything is very much one-sided.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that. I feel like in Australia and maybe in America as well, I sort of always wondered where the intellectual dark web type thing would go. I do feel like it's mostly just gone to the right. Mm-hmm. So I don't really feel attacked from the right at all. Even if I'm talking to a conservative, I still feel like I can bring up issues of public health care or I don't know, various other things and actually have a reasonable discussion. So I'm trying to think of when I've ever, look, I mean, there's no one from the right at uni anyway. Like there's maybe one person, there's like maybe one academic I can think of. So in the union, I mean, there are plenty of students who are from the center and the right. They just often stay quiet. But yeah, I don't really have an experience of being attacked from the right. I don't know, but
I guess,
but it's still, as you can hear from everything I've said, I'm politically charting a middle path. I mean, I know I'm saying things that people in America in particular probably wouldn't like so much, where, the idea of small government is a much stronger idea in America than it is in Australia. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I've been attacked per se, but I get criticisms from, I guess, the right. People who are more to the right of me. One of the criticisms I'll see a lot is that I'm just a liberal who, it's just sort of just in that feminist critique too. I see that a lot. So it is interesting to try to speak to things from a centrist perspective, which is an attempt to balance two sides. It's an attempt to say, I want to find the truth in the balance of these things and not throw one out automatically because it looks like it's of this particular flavor or leaning. And yeah, it just one of the things that I see a lot too on this channel is if I have someone on and they are still pretty left leaning, even if they're very open minded, there'll be a lot of negative criticisms in the comments about that.
Sure.
So I tend to see that, although I wouldn't call it attacks either. It's certainly not like the attacks that I've gotten from the left.
Yeah, I mean, so criticism's fine. It's just when it crosses a threshold and becomes, I suppose, abusive or censorious. Yeah. But there's a decent space. And look, I don't know. I sometimes wonder whether I'm now just a conservative in denial. I'm not quite sure where I'm at anymore because, boy, do I like the sound of family values. You know what I mean? Yeah. But at the same time, I'm unsure about how to deal with capitalism. I'm unsure about how to deal with poor people. I'm not convinced that, small governments, maybe it is, but yeah, there's a lot of open questions that I have. I should also say, it's not even like, the middle path is, it's one thing to sort of start with the middle path and say, I always push for the middle path. It's another thing to try to look at all perspectives and then recognize that actually it's the middle path that's the one that makes more sense. That there's things, even if you look at more extremes on both sides and there's elements of truth in both. So it turns out the middle path is actually the synthesis, which is good. And like to be a little bit more optimistic, I mean, we humans, as we've been talking about, are so damn tribal or religious or whatever. It's almost as if it's very, very hard for us to hold both sides in our head. It hurts. I constantly just want to run to the other side, Yet the glory of democracy and free press and all of that is that even though individuals struggle to find a middle path, when you have democracy, society altogether manages to find something of a middle path. And, democracies are seriously imperfect, but with the system that we have, even if everyone's kind of nuts, somehow we manage to not go off the rails too far in either direction. So that's like the hopeful take on what's going on.
Yeah, that is hopeful. Well, yeah. I want to hear from you if you want to share where people can find you or find your work or find your book, if there's anywhere people can get your book at this point. And then you sent me a Shakespeare sonnet this
Oh
this
yeah.
morning, and so I don't know if you want to close by reading that. Is it brief enough to do a little reading of that?
Yeah, sure. Where can people find me? Look, I mean, you can Google me, Jamie Q Roberts. I've got, I generally avoid social media because it's so toxic. So, like, I'm on Twitter with like no followers and like one tweet. I may yet tweet. I don't know. I opened a Substack because I think I probably want to start writing there, but I haven't yet. But yeah, I honestly think my days in academia are seriously numbered. And so I feel like I have to somehow make the move to independent whatever at some point soon. I don't know. I've written a bunch of articles recently for The Conversation. So, that's, I enjoy doing that. My book, yeah, I don't know. There might be a bit of stock somewhere in a warehouse that made it out. So there's a chance that it could still be found. But yeah, I don't know what the future for that is. Hopefully I can find a way to get it published. Yeah. Shakespeare Sonnet 66. Yeah, thank you. Shakespeare wrote, 154 sonnets. He's not so well known for them. He's well known for the plays. But a few years ago, I started studying the sonnets and was absolutely blown away by them. There's so much to be said about them. But Sonnet 66 is a really remarkable one for a range of reasons. I suppose I could recite it with a dash of analysis. I don't know.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Let me see if I can memorize it because I do not have it in front of me. Okay. But there's a chance. So what does it start out with? I don't know. Maybe I don't know if you can put it up later.
I can prompt you. Yeah.
Oh, no. I think I can do it. I just
okay. I'll put it up I'll put it in the notes along with the links.
In the notes. That's the place for it. Yeah. So what is it? Tied with all these for restful death, I cry. So he's basically saying, I'm about to give you a list of things. I kind of wish I could die. It pisses me off so much. A bit dramatic, but at the same time, the feeling. Like life is so crazy. Oh my God. Mm-hmm. It says, as to behold desert a beggar born, which is remarkable. He actually starts out as a lefty. Mm-hmm. As to behold desert, that's someone deserving, a beggar born. So someone who has ability, skills, is born a beggar and they can't make anything of themselves. Interesting. As to behold desert a beggar born, and needy nothing trimmed in jollity. And needy nothing's like a non-entity. Trimmed in jollity means you've got fancy clothes on. So someone who is not deserving, who has loads of money, basically. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. He starts out quite progressive. Mm-hmm. He moves through a lot of phases. And purest faith unhappily forsworn. So when someone has been faithful, when someone has really believed in something and then they throw it away, that's a really tragic thing to see. And we all know people like that. People who, even if it's like when they're younger and they're like really into skateboarding and then they turn to drugs or whatever, anything like that, And then what's the next line? And gilded honor. Is that right? And gilded honor, shamefully misplaced. It's the same kind of line, you're honorable, you're decent, and then you throw it all away. And then it's, and maiden, this one's really controversial. And maiden virtue rudely strumpeted. That speaks exactly to our cultural moment of the sexual revolution, what we were talking about before. And maiden virtue rudely strumpeted. So it's like, we live in a world now of, easy pleasure, but maybe in pursuing that something is lost, a certain virtue. As I say, it's the more, the internal sensor starts flashing when I read that line. Then what is it? Next line. And right perfection wrongfully disgraced. This is when we start getting more into the university world and the war on merit. So much of at the moment, people are complaining about, diversity initiatives undercutting merit. And right perfection wrongfully disgraced. So the idea that you're actually good at something, but you're poo-pooed and thrown out. So it's amazing. So I'm saying everything is in this poem, and it's 400 years old. And then next line, I believe, is it, and strength by limping sway disabled. So even though he starts out as something of a lefty, in the poem, he still champions merit, quality, strength. He says, and strength by limping sway disabled. So limping sway is essentially, you know, it's kind of like ableist, but he's still using it as a metaphor to say someone who is actually capable is being pulled down by someone who is not capable, which Nietzsche would call slave morality. Then it gets even better. I love those lines. Hopefully I haven't missed one. An art made tongue-tied by authority. That's the line which really does it for me. Art made tongue-tied by authority. So that feeling of glorious creativity, the artist in flow state, you know? That's why Jordan Peterson's often an attractive character. No one quite gets into flow state like him. And when he's in flow state, you're like, wow, he's in flow state and he's doing it on camera in front of people. Wow, you know? But, you know, we see it in so many different ways. Art made tongue-tied by authority. And this is what we've been talking about the whole time, the internal censor. So, you know, you've got something creative and passionate to say or do, but you can't speak because you silence yourself because of authority. Remarkable. What is it? And folly, doctor-like controlling skill. Same point again. So some of the points repeat in the poem. But folly, you know, the person who is in error, doctor-like, amazing image, doctor-like, precisely controlling skill. And that's exactly how I feel so often when I'm dealing with academic types. They write these really long emails and they're so precise, they're doctor-like, and you're reading it and you're just like, this is all so wrong, I don't even know where to begin. But they still spend hours writing this. And you're like, oh man, this is so dark. Folly, doctor-like controlling skill. Then another brilliant line. Simple truth, miscalled simplicity. So often these days we talk about common sense. You know, it's like, this is just so obviously wrong. But if you say that in a lot of intellectual areas, certainly at university, there is a war on common sense. There's a thing, I digress, but there was a thing in the late 90s called the Bad Writing Contest, run by this guy, what's his name? Dennis Dutton, something like that. He's dead now. But he gave awards for the worst academic sentences. And one was awarded to a sentence from Judith Butler. It was very, very interesting. And then she wrote this reply in quite plain English, which was quite interesting. But her whole attack was on common sense. And you often see this at university. Common sense is the bearer of the ideology of the oppressive class. You know, that's a familiar idea. Shakespeare was dealing with the same thing. It's all contained within that line. Simple truth miscalled simplicity. It's like, come on. Anyway, I'm almost there. And what is it? And captive good attending captain ill. Captive good attending captain ill. So someone is actually good, but they're held captive by captain ill. I mean, isn't this life in the institutions these days? There are many good people in the institutions, but they're trapped. They're held captive. I think I'm up to the last two lines. He just repeats it. Tied with all these, from these would I be gone. Save that to die, I leave my love alone. It's quite a remarkable finish because the sonnets are meant to be love poems. And this is not a love poem. This is Shakespeare complaining about all the problems in the world. But it's interesting. He's basically saying, it sounds like he's saying, I'd kill myself, but if I did that, I would lose the connection with the people that matter most to me. So it's really quite a remarkable turnaround in the last two lines. And so he complains about the world. And then at the very end, he reaffirms love and human connection. So yeah, nothing blows me away like Sonnet 66. So I actually am extremely appreciative that you've allowed me to talk about it. And and how remarkable it is that it's everything we're fighting today. And Shakespeare himself is not, he doesn't come across as particularly right or left either. He recognizes the problems of injustice in the world, but then he also supports merit and strength, and he also supports human connection. So yeah, it's just remarkable. Same problems 400 years ago.
That's wonderful. That's such a clear comparison, and it is remarkable. And I'm really glad that you went through that and gave an analysis of it as you went. It's quite phenomenal that we keep repeating patterns as people.
Yeah. And like I am somewhat optimistic. I do find myself agreeing with Steven Pinker. I do think society is improving. But these problems are forever present, and they're forever arising in new forms, and we have to be vigilant, which is why it's so important to read the classics, because you're like, oh, it's that problem again.
Well, I loved studying literature in college, so I could listen to analysis like that all day long. Thanks for taking the time. And
no problem.
Thank you so much for this conversation and for taking the time to speak with me early in the morning, your time.
That's all right. I don't normally drink coffee, but today I had one. I save it for special occasions.
Well, I really appreciate speaking with you, and thank you again, and best of luck with your book. I hope that you're able to get a publisher to pick it up or self-publish, but somehow get the work out.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thanks so much.